pumping. We have to keep doing what we can to develop our natural. So how are you as usual, man? Those chromosomes, you seem to be getting younger.
Well, I've been told so, and I'm starting to believe it.
And you still look like you're just about 45.
I wouldn't like to go past that for a little while.
Okay, Mr. Oliver Seraphine, the second Prime Minister of the Republic of Dominica. Give us a little background about who is O.J. Seraphine.
Well, born in Roseau, grew up in Shillingford's Crescent and Greens Lane and Foncolé. And I believe I remember as a kid growing up, I was in Old Street, lived in Old Street, in New Street, in Virgin Lane, in Fort Lane. Those were the days, when you were hopping, looking for different houses to stay. Mm-hmm. And then it culminated, as Sheridan Gregor mentioned last night, or a couple nights ago, in his program. And he reminded people that his father, who was my next door neighbor's father, that we grew up together just a few feet apart, where we built this house from the Kudma system, self-help. And my father was, put it this way, the first person, the pioneer of commerce in Foncolé, and I grew up in that area there. And of course, I went to grammar school and left to become a salesperson in the Caribbean, and came back home and did the Green Lantern Club, which was the club of the years that it existed prior to the building of the Deepwater Harbor. It was the homes to Swinging Stars and Bell's Combo and Gaylords and all the other bands of the day.
So you were the proprietor of the Green Lantern that is just across where my Boyd area
absolutely.
Is located.
Right. And we brought in bands from the Troubadours came down, and Sparrow was there, and we had groups from the St. Lucia, and Antigua. And, it was alive and kicking. Those were the days when Dominica was really with a lot of music venues. You had the Ham, you had, of course, the old Simon was there, and of course, up in Loubier and different parts up in Trafalgar, like a Fete and what have you. We were bubbling, man, with activity in those days. But the Green Lantern stood out, We actually started off the Friday night parties in Dominica, because prior to that, people go to dances only on Saturdays.
Okay.
But Swinging Stars was having a problem, I think, with Bishop Bogart or somebody, because when they were practicing by Norman's home, they were disturbing, the priesthood. And so they came to the Green Lantern Club to practice, and they were doing that on Friday nights, and people were coming down and dancing for free, while they were practicing.
Interesting.
And then we start off the happy hour there, So I have a backdrop of that. Of course, I started off also with persons like Alvin Knight and Dennis Joseph, and the Gaylords with Hugh Pinard, Gaylords Power Movement, doing shows at the Carib Cinema. And I remember, persons came out of that, Our friend of Liquid Eyes, Tony Valmore, is one of them, who was one of the featured artists there. And I became the manager of his group called the Liquid Eyes.
Liquid Eyes,
and so on. And to me, what culminated for me to be best of whatever I've done was the fact that when Gramax wanted to go to the first outing, leaving Dominica the first time, they went to Guadeloupe, and I gave them a ride for free on the Dominica Airways, which I owned at the time.
Oh, you owned the Dominica Airwaves. I'm talking about what year?
I'm talking about
early 70s?
Yeah, early 70s. Somewhere about 69, 70, going on to 75. And of course, Swinging Stars came along with us. We did trips overseas. We did with the Raymond Lawrence dance troupe. We carried them. We carried a lot of groups, from Dominica to different parts of the Caribbean. But Gramax was my special because Jeff and I had a very good relationship.
Okay.
And he got a free trip to Guadeloupe where he met, and we dates and so on, and he became what he was. But guess what? When I became Prime Minister, I got him to play at the Super Bowl.
At the Super Bowl. We'll get back to that. We'll get back to that, OJ. at what point did you actually get into the political arena?
I got into the politics at a very early age. I think I was around 25 and thereabout, and I became the treasurer of the Labour Party then in '68. I think it was a very early age, and yes, I was about 25.
So that was during the time of E.O. Libla.
E.O. Libla, yes, and I remained in the executive, and then went on to the point of vice president and what have you. And the time came when I think my most positive contribution to Patrick John was in 1974, when the decision to have a replacement for E.O. Leblanc came about. And I've heard people who speak second-hand and third-hand about all of what transpired. But what in fact happened was I had got in touch with Mr. Hugh White, who was in fact, he was my sales manager at British American. I was in the insurance business at one time as well. And he was president of the party and a very good friend of E.O. Leblanc, who whispered to him that he was about to resign. And that is done in stone. He's not changing his mind. And I was informed, and I went to work, and I found out from Acme Trocad, who was the assistant secretary treasurer at the Labour Party headquarters, and she informed me that most people were delinquent. They hadn't paid their dues for the year, you know. And in those days, it's a serious business, you know. If you're not a paying financial member, you can't vote. So I took the list that she had, and I went to certain persons, one of which was Mr. Kuz Latiga, another one was Eustace Francis and others, and we put together money that was required to pay for the fees of those delinquent members.
Okay.
And then my father and Hugh KB and others went to town, especially in the Foncole, Laius, and Joseph and Pottersville areas, and ensured that those people were brought to the convention. And that's where Patrick John was able to beat both Amor and a gentleman from Thomas Etienne, and he became the premier, and he became.
And we're referring to what year? That was what year? And what
1974
conference? 1974 delegates conference. Where was that held?
It was all at Pottersville.
Oh, at Pottersville.
Yes, Pottersville School.
Okay, and you were
part in '75 we had the election of '75, and there we had what is referred to as the electrifying team.
Yes.
Of very, very, very personable and articulate people. In the
Can you recall some of those who went up during the 1975 election?
Yes. I mean, you had Mike Douglas. You also had what's his name? Eustace Francis. You had Ferdinand Parillon. And of course, you had other persons from the north, you know, who were Randolph Banis and Theodore and so forth. You know, you had Luke Corriott also.
Who went up for Granby? Can you recall who went up for Granby in 1975?
We did not have a winner in Granby in '75. Prior to that, you had St. Louis that had won, and you had Fedel and others, but they were from the other party. We didn't have a successful candidate at the '75 elections. But so let me just go back a little bit, because I think there has been a misunderstanding about who or what dominates Portsmouth, which has remained loyal to Labour for all those years. Because in 1973, thereabout, shortly after '74, when Patrick became the leader and we were getting a team to contest the elections, he wanted to ensure that we had the best candidate for Portsmouth. And he, Patrick John, at that point decided to appoint me as a key person to go down and do a search at Portsmouth to find out the legitimacy of Mr. Earl Leslie, who was then the person who had been in government representing the Labour Party in the Portsmouth constituency for some period of time. And when I went down, Mike Douglas was the person that he told me to look at. And Mike had apparently come back from England, where he had some situations that he had resolved with his father, and he came back home. And I found out that he had some popularity, and he's obviously very dynamic in his persuasiveness. And I was able to convince Patrick that, based upon the research I made, that he, Mike Douglas, would be suitable as a candidate for the Labour Party. So that's where you had LeBlanc having been a dominant person in Portsmouth prior to that. Then you had Leslie, who had beaten, of course, LeBlanc had beaten Mike Douglas's father in an election earlier. And Leslie, who was supported by a gentleman called Emmanuel Martin, who was a very, very positive support surrogate, person of interest in the Portsmouth constituency. And so there it was that Labour Party passed on the baton on to Mike to become the candidate. And the Douglases have dominated since then. But it's really originally a Labour Party a constituency, and it's really not necessarily a Douglas constituency as much as it is a Labour constituency.
And you would have worked close with the then Premier Patrick Roland John. What sort of a relationship that you two had?
We had a great relationship initially, and it was a situation where Patrick, I'll give you an example of this. In 1975, prior to that in 1970, at another very early age, in my 20s, I was the chairman of the Central Housing and Planning Authority, where lands were acquired from Elrose and Company in Emsall and in areas in Bath Estate, etc. And from there, the houses were being built in places like Kingsale, Marigot, Point Michel, and so on. And so coming out of that backdrop of experience of 5 years as someone in the Central Housing and Planning Authority, with Flossie Joseph, husband Hubert Joseph being the chief engineer and the person in charge of the physical side, Patrick then made me the Minister of Communications, Works and Housing. And I think that story is interesting because that's where the negotiations began for the housing projects in Bath Estate and in Canefield in particular. And it must be said that we operate in a democracy where you have ministerial authority. And it is good that the bad name or the good name of the responsibilities of ministers will at some point or the other rest with the leader of the cabinet. But it was Patrick John's desire to ensure that we had someone who had the ability to manage the Ministry of Communication, Works and Housing, which I did. At that point, Michael Douglas had begun his tirade against Patrick John. He began going to various rum shops in the northern part of the island and so on, and disdain fully referring to Patrick John in not so pleasant terms. And Patrick John got upset with that whole thing. And in fact, he got tapes being heard of Michael Douglas in various places and not saying pleasant things about him. And so shortly after, within a year of being the Minister of Communication, Work and Housing, where I was able to negotiate with the CDB and DMAS and doing the ministry work, that is, in terms of housing, Patrick decided that he wanted to ensure that the benefits of that very positive ability of government to give housing to the nation would not fall in the lap of Michael Douglas. So what he did was, when he had decided to change ministries, because he thought that Michael was using the Ministry of Agriculture, Lands, Fisheries, and Cooperatives for his own advantage, because it was a very positive ministry where you really impact very well with the great majority of persons, particularly in the rural districts. So he decided to shift ministries. And he then made me the Minister of Agriculture, Lands and Fisheries, and then decided to make Michael Douglas the Minister of Communication and Works. And he stopped there. But all the trucks of the government and all the various public works facades in terms of what was demonstrated on the sides of the vehicle was CW&H. So Patrick had a very strange sense of humor as well. So he says, okay, I'm going to take housing from him because we have done so much work in housing, and I will bring it up to my ministry, and I'm going to make you the chairman of a new housing corporation. So I became a minister and chairman of the housing corporation to push forward the housing projects. He took that away from the Ministry of CW&H, and he said, well, H remains something that has to be replaced with something. And he said, I'll put in hydraulics. So that was his joke at night. So he said, I'll jack him up because he jacked me up around the island. I will jack him up for some hydraulic power. So there was the CWNH becoming Ministry of Communication Works and Hydraulics. So we go on to the point that Patrick and I continued our very good relationship. And in 1977, which I will refer to because I've heard one or two persons who claim to have some positive information about certain doings within the back scenes of the Labour Party. In 77 was a good year for Patrick. That was the year when the Salisbury Declaration and all that came about. That was the year that we decided finally to go to the UK and inform the government of England that there will be an intent, more than an intent, a final decision that Dominica is seeking independence. So who did Patrick choose to go on that team to go and inform the British government? It was Leo Austin, Vic Riviere, the Minister of Finance, and myself. A very interesting thing came up. And that's where I would say that if there's a time in my mind that Patrick deserves some hero consideration, was on our return from that epic meeting to introduce to the British government that the time have come for Dominica to get its independence. The opposition party, the Freedom Party in particular, and other such supporters of the Freedom Party, had mounted a campaign, and a huge mass of people, I'm telling you, a mass of people that began all the way from the Low Black Bridge, going all the way almost to the Dominica Trade Union step, of persons who had gathered to demonstrate against us for having gone to seek independence. We were informed when we arrived at Melville Hall by Desiree John, his wife, and she'll attest to this, that there was going to be a mob action when we entered Roseau on the Low Black Bridge, because people had gathered there and waiting for us. I usually try to think in a certain direction, that is, let's do the thing to avoid problems. And I said to him, let's go up the Santa Roma Road, up Goodwill, go down through the Botanical Gardens and go up to Mount Bruce where we all were staying. Leo was staying there, Patrick was staying there, and so did I. And of course, Vic Rivera had remained in Maho on our way in. I told Patrick, let's just do that and leave the mob standing up there by themselves. They'll be waiting for us until tonight. He says, Mr. Seraphine, I'm not afraid of nobody. We go in through that crowd. And what they do, they do. But I know that we went to fight for our country, and that is what it is. And we drove through, and of course, the top of the vehicle was banged upon, and the glass of the side door was banged upon. It didn't break. And all of that, we went through that. When we could easily have avoided them, and I realized that Patrick have a lot of balls, and I would give him a hero consideration for that effort. Another very, very interesting relationship that I had with Patrick about that same year was we went to Barbados. Somebody said Germany, one of those persons who believe they knew the history said Germany, but we went to Barbados to meet with the British Development Division in the persons of Sir Bruce Greatbatch and the gentleman financial accountability person called David Craxton, who was the second in command at the BDD office. But Patrick and Vic and Leo Austin were stayed in a different hotel. I liked my independence. I didn't want in a social environment to have a premier prime minister looking down on me because I'm a young man. So I came to the meeting early at the BDD office, and I met David Craxton, and he said to me, you're the Minister of Communications, Works and Aviation. Let me advise you that you are on a trip that is going nowhere, because Sir Bruce Greatbatch has contacted Britain, and they are not prepared to give you an international airport, which is what you came for. Patrick had set this up as the agenda. So we then got into that meeting, and he asked me, and he says, that's before PG and others came, and he says, do you have an alternative? Because Sir Bruce has a problem with Dominica. Every time he comes to Dominica, he has to drive from that Melville Hall airport all the way to town, and then, get back. It's 2 days for him. He says, if you had an airport closer to town, we would have been very, very happy to respond to you in a positive way, because Sir Bruce would like to come in the morning, have a mid-morning meeting, and have lunch in Barbados, early dinner. Now, I have been the owner of Dominica Airways, and C.K. Shillingford, who was a pilot of mine, I heard somebody again who seemed to know the history better than I do, said that Patrick got in touch with a pilot from St. Thomas and so on. Truly, C.K. eventually ended up in St. Thomas, but at the time we were speaking, he was working for Air Martinique in Guadeloupe as a flying plane for the protection of plants. He showed me in a discussion, that is CK, that he believes that there was space enough in front of Simon coming all the way down by Daniel Green at the bottom, where they've got the nasty stuff they placed there. And he says that there is enough space for an airport. I remembered that. So at that meeting, I said to this man, David Craxton, yes, there was room for an airport close by, and it's just a few minutes from Roseau. He says, if you can prove that by getting the engineering studies, you will have your airport. So when I came in, I told Patrick that I had this meeting. He said, I don't want to meet in your audience. What I come here for, comrade, is for my international airport. And of course, he was told, just as I was told, that they're not interested, and Patrick is very disappointed. And I believe that was one of the times when Patrick particularly felt the need to get away from Britain, because they didn't want to give him what he wanted, which was that airport, among other things. So lo and behold, a friend of ours at the time, and who had a reputation in different ways, Julian Giro, and that's his true story. Now, people talk like they know everything, but I'm talking from in the room, you know. I was there. I wasn't listening by what somebody says second, third, or fourth hand. I'm telling you what happened because I was part of it. And I'm saying to you that Patrick and I and this gentleman, Julian Giro, met with a pilot at Julian's house who says that he can fly into Canefield. Now, being an airline person myself for many years, I knew it could be done, but I'm not going to be in that plane because I realized that's very risky. Flying over the mountain, which everybody knows is dangerous, over Massac and coming down in and on a road, that's not for me. And Patrick John decided, without my knowledge, he went to the airport, he and Vic Revere, and that same gentleman, that same pilot, flew them in, and Patrick landed at Canefield. All right? No, he proved to, he called Sir Bruce Greatbatch and said, by the way, the Eagle has landed. Bruce Greatbatch wanted to know what that is about. And he says, well, the promise you made that if we can show, we can have this airport where planes can land. I landed there yesterday. And so Bruce quickly, they sent engineers and they worked with Wendell Lawrence, who was my chief technical officer at the time, and voila, here came the airport. Mm-hmm. Another very interesting incident that I had with Patrick at that time, in that same 77. I'm referring to that because it's important that people understand the backdrop, because people seem to think that there was some strategy to remove him in 77, which was not so. He was at the heights of his popularity. In 77. Patrick is a very shy person. He doesn't like pomp and splendor. So Dominica was invited, the head of state, that is the prime minister, the premier at the time, to go and visit the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh on the Royal Yacht Britannia in Antigua, together with all the other prime ministers or premiers. In fact, there was only one at the time, which was Grenada, and all the others, to meet with the Queen and to dine and to. He called me and he says, comrade, I get that invitation, but I even them kind of tuxedo business, you know. So if you want, you can go. So I was sent to represent Dominica and sat with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh at that thing. So I'm showing this to say that there was a link and a friendship.
And a cordial relationship.
And a cordial relationship.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, quite the reverse with Mike Douglas now. Mike Douglas had I think somebody mentioned about the bourgeoisie, the Roseau, and the Go Boogie in Portsmouth and so on. Reference.
I think basically it was referring to the Don Pearson situation which actually failed because it didn't really come through because of who owned the land in Portsmouth area. But
Okay.
OJ, I would like to kind of fast forward to the actual road to independence
Right.
and some of the struggles, and Dominica became independent because we want to actually by the end of our hour touch on the forward movement towards the labor movement, what it meant then, and the philosophy then.
What you would like me to focus on, would it be the
For instance,
sorry.
you Leo Austin and Vic Rivera went to London,
Right.
and you saw the government of England, and
Right.
it finally came down with the mandate that you now go to Dominica is
Now
now
we are
going to
going to go for independence, yes,
right.
based on the Salisbury Declaration.
Right. Dominica now becomes independent from there because
Okay.
I want to drive at the point. Because it has been in the circles that you eventually became prime minister illegally, and I really
Well,
want to speak to
yeah,
that
yeah. Well,
particular.
let me just say this.
Mainly, I just want the history to be recorded as
Right. Let me just put it this way. If I were to start with the Don Pierce, which you referred to, which is a link to all of what's going on. There was the beginning after the independence, shortly after independence, there was that movement for us to go to the international community and to seek relationships. The interesting fact is, Don Pearson did arrive to Dominica, and he offered a free port, which was 45 square miles in the northern part of Dominica. I was a minister of lands, agricultural lands, and so forth. And on a Friday evening, my permanent secretary, Mr. Eardley Castor, came in and showed me the newspaper, the Chronicle, where Dominica had entered into a contract to provide 45 square miles in order to get a free zone, free port. I'm the Minister of Lands. I didn't see that. I wasn't informed. I just saw that in a newspaper. So I called an emergency meeting of Mr. Maxime Forestry, of Colin Booley, who was the Chief Agricultural Officer, and Mr. Robinson, who was the Chief of the Lands and Surveys, and Eustace Francis, an attorney. And we went through the entire contract, and we found out that the contract had some big holes in it, because the 45 square miles was to be paid by the company at $1 a year. But the lands in question, which you just referred to, belongs to what I call LAD, Laville Amon Douglas, to a large extent. All the lands going north. And the interesting thing was there were two contracts. One without the point round, and the other with point round. So there were two contracts signed. The one we saw in the Chronicle, and the one when I demanded a copy of the contract on the Monday of before cabinet, it was shown to me, and I was able to, our technical people deducted that we were signing two different contracts. But in the contract were some difficult situations, which my group of technical people, because the technical people were not brought in prior to the signing of the contract. So those little loopholes came up. And I was able to indicate to the Prime Minister that there were some concerns that we have, because one of the concerns is that you have a right of defense or security by the foreigner, the foreign organization. So that security within 45 square miles means that it comes down to a state within a state. That was number one. Number two, the lands will be paid for at $1, but the owners of the land must be paid as per the Constitution within a reasonable amount in a reasonable time, which means that the government of the people of Dominica now would have to be paid for the lands, etc. So these are some of the concerns that we have. I was able to do it openly in the cabinet. There was almost like a blackboard type situation where I went in and I showed the different difficulties that we have. Look at the owners of the land. Look at how much payment we have to make. This is the value of the land we have to pay back for. And $1 per year wouldn't cut it. So PG at the time said, well, looks like because I'm confronting him openly. I'm not behind his back and I'm in front with my partner. But I'm saying to you that, hey, we have a responsibility. And that is what I believe that is lacking, that persons must understand that even if you have a leader and you have a point of view, you have a right to express that point of view. And I stand by that even up to today. And so here it was at the time that Patrick said to me, well, all right, the gentleman is out there and he needs to come into the cabinet and you all can bring out your difficulties with him. And I remember Don Pearson coming down and saying, well, listen, that was just for show to get investors and so on. I say, it's for sure, but it's written. And I says, our children will come and our children will go. And those is the contract that they will find, that foreign owners came in, took 45 square miles, put up their security, paying $1 a year and all of that. And I said, that's not on our watch. And by then, the cabinet members in that cabinet agreed with that position that I had taken. And we asked Pearson to shift that around. If he could make changes to accommodate our concerns, we'd go along with the project. And he was not prepared to do so because he figures these were the selling points. That's the story of this one. The second thing is post-independence. Leo Austin became the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as he was the Attorney General. Right. I'm going to a meeting, and mark you, this is not no secret, this is serious business. I went to a meeting in the Bahamas for the ACP EEC group to discuss the pricing of bananas and sugar. And when I arrived, all the ministers from Africa, the Caribbean, and Pacific are there, huge meeting. And I'm called aside by the leader of the Barbados delegation, Henry Ford, I think it was. And he says, we have a problem with Dominica. I said, what's that? He says, you now have a foreign person who is an European who is coming into the ACP meeting to discuss the strategies, and we will be discussing our strategies to deal with the EEC later on in the week. And we can't allow somebody from Europe to come in and sit in and listen to our strategies. So therefore, I suggest that you ask him to be removed from your delegation. I called Dominica, and I was told, well, if that's the case, come back home, and we'll discuss that when I get home. The same thing happened in Trinidad, where I was called out. And no, let me conclude. So when I went back into the meeting, whereas you have the name tags for all different countries, Dominica's name tag was removed, an embarrassment. So I came back to Dominica, I told that to the party. But then all of a sudden, one morning, and that's important, I'm spending time on those things because our people understand, it had nothing to do with Patrick John at all, being in any kind of disharmony with his ministers. What was in disharmony with Patrick was his protection of Leo Austin all the way, no matter what. And so he's that kind of person. He stand by you. That's a good thing. But in the case of a party and an organization, where somebody who did not belong to a party, was a civil servant, who is harming our reputation, has to be treated in a way that is responsible for the party. So one day, you might not believe that because it sounds like something like happens in a movie, but I heard a rustling outside my door in Montrose. And there was a brown envelope there. Somebody left and I opened it. And there was information about the Federal Bank of Dominica and other things, and South Africa, with a fellow called Coetzee, who was a minister where Dominica was going to get an oil refinery from and having negotiations and arrangements with the South African government. Details. And then also the Federal Bank of Dominica. Leo Austin happened to have been the vice president of the Federal Bank of Dominica, which was situated by Mark Pringle's office downstairs, the OS, where the OS is right now, 64 King George V Street. And on it was the letterhead of the vice president, which was using 613DO, which was the FedEx, not the FedEx, the one that they use at Kevin Wallace, in telex number, and so on, and his 2401 extension, whatever, 201, whatever it was. All of that was in the document. And his signature at the bottom for transferring millions of dollars from one bank to the Federal Bank of Dominica, a bank from England, Lombard Bank, to the Federal Bank of Dominica. Those documents prove that Dominica had been moving in a situation of a bank, offshore banking, which we didn't know about as ministers. So Patrick, also, when I got the envelope, I went to the meeting with Christian and others, and I said at the cabinet meeting, I said, this is what I've got. Let's read it, let's check it, and so on. When PJ came back from his meeting with Leo and others from England where he was, he said to me, I heard you've been in the cabinet saying things about, I said, well, I got a document, and I'm showing the document, and I am saying that Leo Austin must answer us. I know you're shielding him, so this is a matter we have to discuss about Leo Austin. Not about Patrick. Patrick has never in the pictures, always an innocent party. So in the tolerance of Leo was the problem. So when he came in, Leo came into the cabinet meeting. He said, well, Chief, I had resigned. So somebody, I don't know, Vic Rivera body, somebody said, well, let us get the letter. What you talking about? You resign. So he goes up to his office. We spend about 20 or 30 minutes waiting for him. He comes back and he shows a letter that he resigned as vice president of the Federal Bank of Dominica, which means that he was, in fact, originally a vice president. And the cabinet and everybody was out there shouting and screaming that there was never such a bank. So we had a lot of those issues with him and this question of the contract that he signed with. So I insisted that Leo be removed from the cabinet and replaced with someone else.
Okay. Let's now go now to the Salibia convention.
Right.
And what transpired there,
right. Because, okay, let's go to this. I think we should.
I read a little of H.L. Christian book, a little of H.L. Christian book, debating that there was some movement behind Patrick's back when he was in Barbados. It was kind of offset him because you were then the chairman. Let's bring us up to date from your own perspective as to what transpired.
Right. First of all, we operate a system, and I think when recently there was a discussion with, I think, Francis and how it was to make changes with the leadership of the UWP and so on, and there's a procedure. At no time as chairman of the party, I know Mr. Christian knew that there were issues with Mike and PJ and so on, which eventually led to Patrick John. Contrary to what I heard about how he was told to fire ministers and he didn't, he actually did. He fired the ministers that he thought were hostile to him, which was Mike Douglas and Ferdinand Parlour. In the meeting in Salibia, of which I was the chairman, I'm not aware that there was ever anything on the agenda that had to do with the challenge to the leadership. There was always a challenge, however, to the leadership of Patrick John by Mike Douglas from the time he came into the became a minister of government in 1975. He had a lot of issues with Patrick for removing him as Minister of Agriculture and taking away housing. They had their problems. It is obvious that there would have been an issue for Mike to seek to become leader of the party, which he did with me sometime later. But however, in my case, as chairman of the party, Christian wrote what he wrote from his perception. Now, perception and reality is two different things. For a person to be removed as a political leader of an organization, you must first of all do the following. You must contest or have some constituency branch or whatever to nominate you as the political leader. That's number one. That's on the party side. On the government side, you must also have a number of persons in the cabinet that seeks to ensure that you are able to get a majority of elected members in the parliament to give you the support to become the new leader of the party, of the cabinet, and by that definition, become the prime minister. I have very great difficulty in understanding what was concluded about Mike would be leader and I'll be deputy. Why would I want to be a deputy leader to Mike Douglas? My political agenda at the time was Massa They Die. That everybody knew me on the political platform, knew me to be a very aggressive pro-people person, extolling the virtue of the man who is unfortunate and dispossessed. That has been my trait. When I became into government, my hallmark was to ensure that the small man became recognized. I would find it very difficult to understand why should I want Mike Douglas to be a leader to me instead of Patrick. It didn't make any sense, because I didn't see Mike Douglas as that kind of person. I knew him to be a conniving person at the time, which proved to be so later on, which is a long story, which will evolve later on at some other venue as to how Patrick John was treated when he became involved with his court matter and led him to prison. Who were the people behind it, and how did it come about, of which where Mike was involved and where Ruth was involved and so on. That will come later. But for now, let me just say categorically, I found it very rude and obnoxious to think that I had a plan to work with Mike to remove Patrick. That was never such a situation. Mike and myself never had that kind of relationship.
Okay, entertaining the leader, I mean the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Dominica. There are quite a bit of political pundits who felt that the procedure for you attaining interim Prime Minister was somewhat illegal. Can you just bring us back to that time?
I think we are suffering from memoir pool, because what transpired at that time was that there was a coup. I have said it before. There was an uprising. The pictures, the information, the newspaper articles from the newspapers of the day in Dominica and the Caribbean attest to that. The information was that I had resigned. I had resigned as a member of the cabinet based on the fact that I had written a letter to the political leader and given him my ultimatum, that especially now that this thing has come about, the 29th of May, and all that we have been going through in cabinet with Lee Austin, that the time has come for him to remove Lee Austin and save the party. And I said, if that doesn't happen, I will have no choice but to resign. Patrick had 16 members in parliament. I didn't anticipate, unless I was a clairvoyant, that when I resigned on my principle, I didn't anticipate that the men would have fallen. Nobody could have convinced me that within days that the opposition would be so aggressive.
So your main reason for resigning is because you wanted Lee Austin out of the...
Absolutely. Totally. I had nothing
but then just backtrack slightly.
Yeah.
You recommended Mike for Portsmouth.
I recommended Mike for Portsmouth
Leslie,
as per the instruction of the leader of the party.
Yeah, but then when you began or you start experiencing problems, what you did then, to actually neutralize your recommendation for Mike then? Because you recommended him as the popular guy, as the guy that was, the best person
popular in Portsmouth, yes. Yeah.
But then when he began kind of infiltrating the leadership now of the Labour Party, you made any moves to actually neutralize that particular move and stick with Patrick John then? I'm just asking.
But Mike, but to be very honest with you, Mike was not a challenge to PG at all. He never was a challenge to Patrick John. He was a voice in the wilderness, He went out there and Patrick removed him as minister of this, replaced him, fired him, and he was out there, and all he had that the possibility of doing is to retain the Portsmouth seat, which he had contested in 75.
Yeah, but then the legitimacy
he was never an issue in the party.
Yes. But then the legitimacy, because before we end, I want to also give you the opportunity that during your tenure, some of your achievements as Prime Minister. Because I lived those days, I remember two things in particular. I was a little boy, but I remember the balloon, the balloon in the air. I remember the OJ dollars. But then we will talk about the achievements.
But to me, the achievements will come. But let me just say, yes, I'm right. By the way, let me just butt in here.
Yeah,
I would like to say this. There's a call for clarity and a desire to bring out our history from the dusty cobwebs of the past, right?
I agree 100%.
Right. And more recently this week, we had persons in Q95 having such a discourse.
Yeah.
the former prime minister and so on, and others who are talking about writing a book and so on. I am about 90% complete with my book,
Which will be entitled.
which will be entitled Stolen Legacy, Give Honor Where Honor is Due.
Okay.
And that will have a lot of information that you're seeking. But I don't think I should allow myself to be transplanted into things I did, because things I did are enormous. Land reform, taking estates from the so-called upper class in different places, and whether it be Elrose and Company, whether it be at La U, whether it at what Waven and Mont Prosper and Picard and Chance and this and that, and lands in the Globomia area and in Salisbury Heights and in Marigot Heights and so on.
OJ, these things are important to us because there is no way or no avenue we could get the information, and that's why it was very important to have you here.
Right.
You were the second prime minister, and there are some misconceptions as to how you became prime minister, the legitimacy of it, and I want that discussion to be more educational for the people who can decide.
Right. It is very important that let us understand this one. I don't know how much more time we have. But the situation was that it was not business as usual
in the country,
where you could go to the House of Assembly, as someone was saying, Pundit was saying, and then there would have been a vote on no confidence and so on. That's not a normal situation. You had a president who flew away in the middle of the night. You had another president that was stoned out of, his commitment to become president. His vehicle was overtaken and burnt in the center of town. You have ministers who were stoned. You have difficulties where persons who were supporting the party had their business places, mobs went in there and looted and so forth and so on. You had threats. You had Prime Minister Patrick John at the time at Mont Bruce, where there was a plan to go in up there and take him down. There was an attempt possibly to take his life. Patrick was aware of all of that. He put sandbags, his wife will tell you so, outside of residence in preparation for the mob to come to get him. All of his ministers had resigned because of the Cool Wash Brigade, as they call them. So you had a situation where the best of our people, the Committee for National Salvation, the whole country's leadership, which represented every arm, every possible person of the country, was supported by the Committee for National Salvation. That included all the trade unions. That included the church leaders of the state. That included every single person within the Employers Federation, be it youth organizations and so on, the names of which are very luminous, including Sheridan Gregoire, who was the one who came and connected with me as a childhood friend to say, listen, the Committee for National Salvation has reached a stalemate. They haven't got an answer to the problem, because the reality for them was, if they were to take over, Eugenia came in, she could not command a majority in the parliament to become a legitimate constitutional prime minister, to effect the allowance of a president coming in and bring back our constitution. I agreed to form the Democratic Labour Party. And there it was that members of Patrick's Dominican Labour Party in Parliament came along and decided to support me, together with Conrad Cyrus and other persons, and formed a constitutional level of 11 plus, which I think was 13 or 14 persons, who came together and agreed to give support to me as incoming prime minister. I never applied for the job. I was on my way to my wife's house in the Carib Territory area, Atkinson, when I was met by someone when I stopped at Venus guest house for a couple nights, who said that they have come from the Committee for National Salvation. You're talking about every leader of our country. You're talking about masses of people who had gathered to stone Patrick out of office. You reach a point when the country was in total disarray. We had no constitution process in place. And I would say quite the contrary. I demand from the Dominican people and from the government of today the respect and the dignity to be given to me for having taken the responsibility to take this country on and support the constitutional process to bring back governance and to get people like Percival, like Mari, to become the president and so forth, and which led to a constitutional what do you call that, election to be
In
called
1980.
at the time. I demand from Dominica the respect that I deserve. 3 months later, when Hurricane David came, I also demand the respect for the activities that was done at Hurricane David, where the country was brought back to normalcy and we had an election within a short space of time. I gave back to the country that which was removed, which was the constitutional mandate. And I declare that anybody who's trying to contribute to the contrary, I say that you have not understood what transpired. Jennifer White, who was the clerk of the House of Assembly, gave her information on DBS Radio, as did Bernard Nicholas and as did our friend Curtis Augustus, who spoke on that very same issue, pointing out how this country had reached a point where it had no way to turn. I was the savior at the time to come to bring that country to normalcy. And I didn't go and beg for a job. I was not part of the CNS. Sheridan Gregoire and Eustace Francis came and seeked me out to come to town to meet with these people. And then they offered me, so I said, well, what you offer, and you can't offer me nothing. CNS can't offer me leadership. Leadership must come from the house. But there was no process in a normal, idyllic way where you could say, well, okay, Patrick, come in there, call a vote of no confidence again. No. Because the country was already shredded. The constitution was shredded. You had a president that had escaped, another one that was stoned, and his house and his vehicle burnt, and his family under threat, and he resigned. So I came in at the time to save the country's ability to find a solution. So I was a solution finder in the process. That's how Democratic Labour Party was formed, to allow for persons in the PGA government to join me and become part of the change within the parliament. Not in a normal way of constitutional process of vote of no confidence. And so that's when you're normal. The vote of no confidence was called against Patrick John, by Eugene Charles. And I believe I was one of the principal speakers, if you look at the Hansard, that was able to stand up and fight for Patrick John's legacy, to justify his being a leader. A vote of no confidence was called against Eustace Francis, And let me say this now. This ugliness of trying to turn around things, and 40 years later, there were governments that took activities in those days that didn't recognize Patrick John. Edison James's government in 1995 to 2000 never recognized Patrick John, never came up with that situation or looking for giving him any kind of recognition except for the job he got. But I'll say this too, that Edison James's government recognized me as well. And I was made the chairman of the National Development Corporation from 95 to 2000, where Sheridan Gregoire was also a director at the time. And Edison James actually chose me to become the chairman of the NDC, where you had persons like Pascal of Afro, where you have the present president of the ULP that was there, Sheridan Gregoire was there, Afi Martin was there, a number of persons, some of the brightest, the gentleman Gabriel from Coca-Cola. And Edison chose me, and so did Norris Prevost, and of course, Julius Timothy. They chose me to come, and guess what came out of it? Creole Festival came out of it. Nobody talks about that in 1996. So let me just say this. I'm not here defending anything, I'm asserting a position of authority that I stood up when the country needed me. Guess what? There was a defense force that was pro-Patrick. There was a police that was pro-Eugene Charles. And I was there. I had to form the civil defense unit of a group of young people to defend me in the event of any situation. My wife was at Springfield when somebody shouted from the police defense force. Person shouted, OJ is wanted. My wife answered, is it dead or alive? So I was under threat. My wife had to call Major Newton, come and take all the people over there because she's been threatened. It was not an easy one for me because I was not living in a paradise, I was under a lot of stress, having come from a situation where the night when I left my place, I will say this last one. The night I left my place, when I resigned, this guy, Mighty Lily, or President Lily, was a guest. He stayed the night at my house. When I left to go to the Carib Church, and I stopped by Venus, there were defense force fellas surrounding the house. Lily had to go and hide underneath her bed. So there was a threatening situation. I put my life on the line for my country. So I'm very, very disturbed when anybody trying to play little games about whether it is constitutional. No. It was not constitutional because Patrick John did not go through a process of constitutional change. came through a process of revolution. And in a revolution, you have to find revolutionary means to create the new environment that brought back to life the constitution of our country, which I did. I need my praises for that.
OJ, quite a bit of food for thought. But we have a few minutes, just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
The early philosophy of the Labour Party then, you would have been part of, the whole construction of those policies and the early philosophy of the Labour Party then. What were some of those major points, major highlights in terms of, yes?
The major highlights was the one of Leblanc, who understood the plight of the little man and who chose to fight for the benefits of those who are considered to be children of the countryside, as opposed to the benefits accrued upon and created by those considered themselves bourgeois and upper class. That was the fight, the social revolution. So the social revolution was the critical point of the Labour Party. PJ, to give him his credit, also came up with "Let the little man walk tall." That was also the creative animus that decided that we must now, as persons who are less fortunate, start getting opportunities, which included housing, land reform. I dare say that at the time when Leblanc came in and PJ came in, about 90% of Dominica's arable lands, estates, were owned by about 5 to 7% of the population. And we created that change. Nobody talks about the fact that after Hurricane David, for example, talking about housing in Bath Estate and Kinfield, nobody talks about the Royal Bank housing program, which I instituted right there in Bath Estate. Right on the other side.
That's the other side. That's the
on
other
the other
side.
side. Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about the 800 houses that I constructed after Hurricane David from the SAWS, Seventh-day Adventist World Service Program, which was built all over Dominica. Nobody talks about the houses that was constructed just in the end of Bath Estate. As you enter Bath Estate on that side in front of you, as you driving through Bath Estate, right in front of you on that area there, there were houses that were built. They even call it OJ Village at one point. Nobody talks about the houses that was built in Pishley by Seventh-day Adventist World Service that was done under Mitre. Nobody talks about the fact that under OJ Seraphine administration, that I just mentioned it earlier and I'll repeat it again, that we took the lands at Soufriere from Elrose and Company, that we took the lands at One Prosper and Wharton River and Layo and Woodford Hill. And guess what? A lot of those people who failed to understand what had transpired, the lands that were taken, even in Trafalgar, was returned by Eugenia Talks. Attempts were made to return it. And there was a famous case from Wharton Waven, where Babs Dyer represented a client, a cousin of mine called Felix. And Ronan David represented the Freedom Party at the time, where they thought that the lands that was acquired was not properly done. Only to find out that the lands taken from Roll in Wharton Waven and Mount Prosper were taken by the O.J. Seraphine administration. And so what we thought of doing, therefore, was to ensure nobody talks about the Cuban scholarship, the Cuban scholarship. There is an anniversary program that was launched by a magazine with the dentist, who was the founder of that.
As Dr. Damien Dublin.
Dr. Damien Dublin, who attests to the fact that O.J. Seraphine administration and government started this Cuban scholarship program. Nobody talks about the fact that there was, and people forgot, that there was a contract that was signed with my government to extend the Ross University to a Ross and Veterinary University, to teach vets.
To add a veterinary section to the medical
That's
section.
Right. And it was done. It started. There was a man called Mac Lawrence, who was a seaman from Portsmouth, who, when Eugenia came in, he started giving Dr. Ross the genius that gave Dr. Ross so much pressure. She turned around and she decided that she's going to put pressure on Ross because he's getting too much benefits from the original contract that he had signed with me. That, guess what? Ross decides he's going to send kits. And Mac Lawrence, the captain, had to carry all the animals and all the different equipment to go to St. Kitts to open the Ross University Veterinary School in St. Kitts, which still exists. And guess what? The day when Ross University was moving from the week that they were moving from Dominica on their way to Barbados, Ross Veterinary School was expanding. You understand? In St. Kitts. And
finally, we already ran out of time. But finally, how would you like to be remembered? You know, in the annals of history of Dominica.
I would like to be remembered as the person that brought Dominica out of a constitutional crisis, that created an avenue for us to get governance back in the country in a legitimate fashion to pass it on. So that today we have elections every 5 years. Nobody knows the fact that I had got the defense force had approached me at my residence at Springfield to turn around and say, listen, we don't need to give up no government. Newton and Benji and all they said to me that you came in at a time of revolution, keep the government. You don't need to do that because you just came from a hurricane. I refuse to do that. I could have done that. I gave you back, you the people of Dominica, back your constitution. I created an avenue where we end up with Marie as a governor, as a president. So I gave back constitutional. So I'll always say that there have been no leader, prime minister, and or for that matter, minister that have acquired more lands than Oliver Seraphine in government.
Thank you very much, Oliver Seraphine. On that note, we must come out now because we have the major news coming up. But I really want to thank you for enlightening us from your perspective. And I'm looking forward to that book when it's totally completed. And I can imagine it will be a very good read.
It will be explosive.
OJ, I really thank you. As explosive as how you were today.
I don't think I sufficiently was.
I really want to thank you for joining us on Creole Heartbeat, a very special one. Next week, we will be dealing with Mike Douglas, Rosie Douglas, that is, and he would normally have been 80 years if he was alive today. So we'll be talking to members of his family, Rosie Douglas, next week on Creole Heartbeat. Thank you very much. The major news comes up next.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Sakai Malad, Prince Wadix, Prince Wadix, Prince Wadix, Prince Wadix. Kakou an wete ba moun flen la yo manja kite la vi. Apresye sa yo ka fe kon yo apami nou jodi. La se mouve vale fye non nou ka konsipe moun ebi. Pour nous connaître, nous meilleurs, c'est pour nous tout ça bénéfice. For only wonders you done for us all, spreading the culture all over the world. For only good thing that you done for God, that's what it is. We thanking you, brother.